Good morning. Happy Wednesday, everybody. It's time for Coffee with PC. I do have my cup of coffee here. It is officially summer. It is blessed hot outside, as I'm sure you're aware. So I need to get off the caffeine and get on to a different kind of liquid like water. And I hope you're doing that too, especially if you have to be outside at all this time of year. Hey, what I want to do today is back up to Sunday. Because there was a part toward the end of the sermon. We're in Hebrews chapter 2. We finished up Hebrews chapter 2 on Sunday. And I think I kind of rushed through a point that deserved probably more explanation. And I don't know if that was because I didn't really have complete notes on it. It occurred to me as we got to it in the text. And we were getting on toward the end of the sermon and the end of our time together. So I thought I would back up today and talk about this idea, because it's not just a Hebrews idea. This word, this concept shows up several times in the New Testament. It's a pretty important actual concept that it bears kind of fleshing out a little bit more. The particular verse in question is verse 17, and it ends this way. Well, actually, I'll just read the whole verse, verse 17. For this reason, he had to be made like them. Jesus had to be made like us, humans, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. That phrase, make atonement, I mentioned on Sunday that word, that phrase in English here in the NIV translation is what I'm reading out of, might be translated differently in other translations. Probably the most often way that word is translated is propitiation. He might make propitiation for the sins of the people. Sometimes it's also translated expiation, and I think expiation isn't quite used as often as propitiation, but either of those words could be there. And it brings to mind when we're talking about translations, I've had this discussion in several different arenas lately, just in regard to the art that is in translation and the fact that all translation from one language to another, not just biblical translation, but any kind of translation from one language to another, is interpretation, because translation isn't always a one-to-one relationship. Words have a range of meaning. It's often called their semantic range. We see the same thing in English. And in translation, you take a concept from another language and you try to convey it with a word in the language you're translating to. In this case, a word and a concept from Greek to translate into English. And that's why sometimes, and in lots of different translations, not just this word, but lots of words, there are differences in how certain translations handle them. The NIV chooses make atonement, and I tried to explain why on Sunday. So what I wanted to do today is more specifically, maybe more slowly, talk about what is the range of meaning of this Greek word that is sometimes translated propitiation, sometimes translated expiation, and in this case, and by the NIV largely, atonement or sacrifice of atonement. And here's my thesis, if I might. It means all of those things. The range of the word has in mind all of propitiation, expiation, and atonement. Now, what we need to do, and probably what is the reality for most people, is what does propitiation mean versus expiation? I maybe kind of know what atonement is, but what's going on? What do those words mean? And I didn't explain this very well on Sunday, so let me talk about those words. I'm going to start first with expiation, which is kind of the one that's probably not very often used, but is at times used in English translations. Expiation starts with the prefix ex, ex, which we know ex means out of, that sort of thing. And so the idea that is in there is it's to remove something or take something away. So as it relates to Jesus, in this case, making atonement for the sins of the people or expiating the sins of the people, the idea is that he covers over, he cleanses, he takes away the negative, the degrading, the curse effects of sin from us by his grace. So that's the idea behind expiation. Ex, out of, to remove something, that we have this sin and the corruption, we might say, that comes from it. And expiation has in its idea that is removed. The negative and degrading effects of sin are removed from us. And so you can see how what Jesus did is to expiate the sins of the people, to remove the negative, the degrading, the curse of sin, and ultimately the fact that it separates us from God. So we can see that idea in what we think about Jesus did by his death and resurrection. What about the word propitiation? Now, if we can just use prefixes again, ex means out of, pro means for. If you're pro something, you're for something. And so you can see even in the prefixes a little different idea. So if expiation is the effect on us, propitiation is the effect for God. Particularly, it's the idea of appeasement or satisfaction, that God's wrath is appeased, that his wrath that would naturally come to us because of our sin that separates us from him, his wrath that would come to us is propitiated. It's taken away. It's appeased. If you want to see kind of a crude idea of this is a common thing that happens in many religions, that you have to appease gods. Ultimately, the proverbial throw the virgin into the volcano to appease the gods, so whatever calamity or tragedy that might befall would stop. Or some other sacrifice that when the gods are mad at you and bad things are happening, you do this propitiating them so that they'll remove their wrath. And so we have this idea also in this word, expiation, to cover over, to remove the degrading negative effects of sin. That's more about how we're affected. Propitiation toward God, how his wrath is covered over so that we don't experience it. So you can see both of those things. Now, but at the same time, they're kind of, we might say, technical words. Those aren't words you're going to run into in most of your life. They're typically, church words, Bible words is where we see those. But I don't think that's the reason, for instance, the NIV chose, in this case in Hebrews, make atonement for, or elsewhere chooses sacrifice of atonement instead of, at the time when this was translated, the more widely used expiation or propitiation. And that's because this word in Greek is unique. Now, particularly for the book of Hebrews, a little thing we certainly don't see in English. We do see that in the book of Hebrews, the Hebrew Bible is quoted a lot. Pushing 100 times the Hebrew Bible is quoted or referenced in the book of Hebrews. A lot. That's obvious, whether it's the indentations or other things. What we don't see in our English translations is the version of the Hebrew Bible that was quoted. Most of the quotes of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and I probably should say Old Testament here, aren't from Hebrew. They're from the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that's called the Septuagint. That was for the people in this audience to whom Hebrews was maybe originally addressed as a sermon and later written down as a book or as a letter. That was their version. That was their copy. They actually had a translation of the Hebrew Bible, not in Hebrew, but in Greek, because that was the language that they were more familiar with. The Septuagint was a very popular, widespread use version of the Old Testament in the first century. The writer of Hebrews, when he quotes the Hebrew scriptures, he quotes from the Septuagint more often than from the Hebrew. Just once or twice, I think, does he quote from the Hebrew. Why is that significant? Well, this word that's propitiation or expiation or atonement or sacrifice of atonement, when you see that word is a word that's used in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, known as the Septuagint, for a particular thing. And that particular thing is what's called the mercy seat that sits on top of the Ark of the Covenant. So as the writers are translating the Hebrew Bible into Greek and they get to the law where we see the instructions for building the tabernacle in the wilderness, and then the Ark of the Covenant, and then this mercy seat with the angels, the cherubim over it with their wings stretched toward each other, made out of certain materials. And then later when we get to the instructions about the High Holy Day, namely the Day of Atonement, and what the high priest does on the Day of Atonement, in both of those places in the law, this Greek word that's translated in the New Testament, like in Hebrews or in Romans 3:25 and elsewhere, as propitiation, expiation, or sacrifice of atonement, is used for that cover of the Ark of the Covenant. And so that becomes, for the people of the original audience of this book of Hebrews, one image that's in their mind when this Greek word is used. We have cultural images in our mind. For instance, if I were to say September 11th to somebody today, you have an image in your mind. You know exactly, I don't have to describe what happened that day. I don't have to go into detail. You probably remember exactly where you were, and you know what that means because it's a cultural shared idea that just by saying September 11th, which by itself is just a date on the calendar that happens every year, has greater significance because it's tied to a significant event. Well, I'm going to suggest to you this Greek word is tied to a pretty significant event in the annual observance of the life of Israel, namely the Day of Atonement, when the high priest goes in and through a very elaborate series of rituals, after making atonement for himself through sacrifices, through washings, goes into the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant is, and sprinkles the blood with the hyssop on the mercy seat, or the seat of atonement. To what? What does he go in there to do? Well, he's going in there to make atonement, which involves in it to cover over, to remove the negative and degrading effects of sin that has been on the nation of Israel for the previous year. This is a once a year time. So he removes it, symbolized not just by the sprinkling of the blood, but also by the laying of hands on the scapegoat that's sent outside the camp as the picture, the image, the metaphor that the sins of Israel are removed from the camp. And also, he is doing these things as a way to, we might say, appease the wrath of God and the curses of God that should rightfully come upon Israel for their sin. This elaborate Day of Atonement sacrifice and ritual is meant to appease God and to bring his blessing on them. So you see the propitiation, the expiation idea in this sacrifice. And so I think what we see here in the mind of the people in the book of Hebrews probably wasn't either of those English words, but it was the whole picture of the Day of Atonement, which is why I like the idea that the NIV uses sacrifice of atonement. I don't know if they could write mercy seat in there, because that doesn't necessarily translate to an English audience that's the Gentile, not familiar with the rituals of Egypt and the high holy days. But for the audience of Hebrews, it's very significant. And so I say all that to say, one, I don't think I explained it very well on Sunday, so I hope this makes more sense. Why certain translations pick up certain things, and why sometimes one particular word doesn't give us the full sense of meaning that's behind there. And secondly, to show you that there are images in the text that even in translation we're going to miss because we don't share the culture and the history and the religious traditions of the people. And this, I think, is one of them. I think that word is specifically used, in this case in Hebrews and elsewhere in the New Testament by Paul and others, to conjure in the mind of the people not just we've been forgiven, which we have, but all that is going into that ritual of the Day of Atonement to provide the covering of sin, removing its negative effects, and appeasing the wrath of God so that the people can be restored to right relationship with God. And the writer of Hebrews is saying Jesus does that for us. And the beauty of who Jesus is in this verse is also, it tells us he's a merciful and faithful high priest. He's the priest. He's the high priest. The high priest, the only one that can go behind the veil into the Holy of Holies. He's that person. But he's also, what else? The one who is the high priest offering the sacrifice is the sacrifice itself. And that's the beauty and the majesty and the superiority of Jesus. Not an earthly temple, we'll see this later in Hebrews, but this heavenly temple. And so I think this image here will play very much the priestly image, Jesus as high priest, and the ritual, the Day of Atonement, the mercy seat image found in that one verse is unpacked in the next 11 or so chapters of Hebrews. I hope we'll have fun seeing all that is unpacked to mean as we go. But in the short term, I hope that was a better explanation than the blowing over it real quick on Sunday that might have been less helpful and maybe a little more confusing. So I felt it was, so I wanted to kind of flesh it out a little bit more. Didn't think I did a good job, so I wanted to do that today. Anyway, little technical talk, but I hope it's helpful for you. I think the beauty of the scriptures is all of these interconnected layers, that because we're American, not Jewish, because we're B, 21st century American, not first century Jews, and C, Gentile, because we don't have that shared history and tradition, and aren't raised in the Torah and the law and all of that, that we can miss some of the, especially in Hebrews and really in all of the New Testament, the beauty that the Old Testament and the background that the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible brings to these scriptures. So that's what I'm hoping to convey through this study of Hebrews and a little bit today. All right, I'm going to call our time together done. I'm going to go finish my coffee. I'm going to go get back to the rest of my day. Love to have you join us on Sunday. As always, we get started at 9 o'clock. We'll be in Hebrews chapter 3. Be here live in person. We'll be online as well. Either way, love to have you be a part of it. Hope your week is a great one. Hope the rest of this week, even in the heat, will be good for you. So take care of yourself and look forward to seeing you soon.